On the evening of September 18, 1983, Jessica Hartman reached into her boyfriend's wallet looking for a $20 bill and found something that would force her to choose between the man she loved and the country she'd sworn to serve. The wallet was sitting on the dresser in their West Los Angeles apartment, a small one-bedroom unit on the third floor of a building that overlooked Sepulveda Boulevard. Jessica was 28 years old. She worked as an administrative assistant at Hughes Aircraft Company in El Segundo, a position she'd held for 3 years, a position that required a security clearance because of the nature of the documents that crossed her desk. Her boyfriend, Daniel Kovač, was in the shower. She could hear the water running through the thin bathroom door, could hear him humming something she didn't recognize, probably Czech, probably something from his childhood in Prague, a city she'd never visited but had heard him describe in careful detail during the 14 months they'd been together. The pizza delivery was late, and when the buzzer finally sounded from downstairs, Jessica realized she didn't have any cash. She'd asked Daniel before he got in the shower if he had a 20, and he'd said yes, told her it was in his wallet, told her to grab it. She opened the wallet, a brown leather bifold worn soft at the edges, and began looking through the bills. Behind his driver's license and 2 credit cards, tucked into a sleeve she'd never noticed before, was a small rectangular piece of film, no larger than a postage stamp, dark and slightly curled at the edges. Her first thought was that it might be a negative from old photographs, something he'd forgotten to develop, something left over from a family trip or a moment he'd wanted to preserve. But when she held it up to the lamp on the dresser, angling it toward the light, she saw text. Tiny, dense columns of text. Technical diagrams. Numbers arranged in tables. And in the corner, barely visible but unmistakable to someone who'd spent 3 years handling classified materials, a marking that indicated restricted information. Her hands began to shake. The film slipped from her fingers and fell onto the dresser, landing silently on the wood surface. She felt her stomach tighten, felt the apartment suddenly become smaller, the walls pressing in, the sound of the shower now unbearably loud in her ears. She picked up the film carefully, as if it might burn her, and placed it back into the wallet exactly where she'd found it, making sure the credit cards were positioned the same way, making sure nothing looked disturbed. She closed the wallet and set it back on the dresser. The buzzer sounded again from downstairs. She grabbed her purse, pulled out a 20 from her own wallet, and went to the intercom to tell the delivery driver she'd be right down. When she returned with the pizza, Daniel was out of the shower, standing in the kitchen in sweatpants and a t-shirt, his hair still damp, smiling at her the way he always did, open and easy and affectionate. He asked if she'd found the money in his wallet. She told him no, that she'd just used her own cash, that it was easier. He thanked her and said he'd pay her back tomorrow. They ate pizza on the couch and watched the news. Something about tensions in Beirut, something about the Soviet Union and arms negotiations. Daniel made a comment about Reagan's foreign policy. Something critical but vague, the kind of remark he often made. And Jessica realized she was listening to him differently now, analyzing his words for hidden meaning, for signs of allegiance she'd been too naive to notice before. That night, lying in bed beside him, listening to his breathing slow and deepen as he fell asleep, Jessica stared at the ceiling and wondered how much of the past 14 months had been real. Jessica couldn't report what she'd found without being certain, and she couldn't confront Daniel without tipping him off to her discovery. So, for the next 3 weeks, she lived in a state of suspended reality, conducting a surveillance operation against the man who slept beside her every night. She began by checking his wallet every time he showered, a routine that occurred predictably each morning before work and each evening after his supposed translation sessions at the library. On September 24th, 6 days after her initial discovery, she found a second piece of microfilm tucked into the same hidden sleeve behind his credit cards. This one was different, darker, with what appeared to be technical schematics when she held it to the light. By September 26th, it was gone, replaced 2 days later by another. A pattern was emerging, and Jessica documented it in a small notebook she kept hidden inside a box of tampons in the bathroom cabinet, a place she knew Daniel would never look. She began reviewing their relationship with new eyes, replaying moments that had seemed innocent at the time, but now carried different weight. They'd met in October of 1982 at a bookstore in Santa Monica, in the foreign language section where she'd been browsing French novels and he'd been looking at Czech poetry. He'd struck up a conversation, charming and self-deprecating, explaining that he was a freelance translator trying to maintain his connection to his native language. They'd gone for coffee. He'd asked her what she did for work, and she told him she worked in administration for an aerospace company, carefully vague because of her security obligations. He'd seemed genuinely interested, but not pushy, asking follow-up questions that felt natural at the time, but now seemed calculated. How long had she worked there? Did she enjoy it? Was the work challenging? She'd answered freely, flattered by his attention, never considering that he might be cataloging information, assessing her value as a potential asset. The phone call she'd ignored began to bother her. Daniel received calls several times a week, always brief, always in Czech, always ending abruptly if she entered the room. He'd explained that these were clients, Czech immigrants who needed documents translated, who felt more comfortable speaking in their native language. She'd accepted this explanation without question. Now she listened more carefully when the phone rang, noting that he never used names, never mentioned specific documents, always kept his responses to yes, no, and brief acknowledgments that revealed nothing about the content of the conversation. On October 3rd, a Thursday evening, Daniel told her he had a meeting with a client downtown and would be back by 9. Jessica waited 15 minutes after he left, then got in her car and followed the route she knew he'd take toward the Central Library. She found his car in the parking structure and positioned herself near the entrance where she could watch without being seen. At 7:43 p.m., Daniel walked into the library carrying a newspaper, the Los Angeles Times folded under his arm. Jessica followed at a distance, watching as he took a seat at a table near the periodicals section. He opened the newspaper and appeared to read, but his attention kept drifting to the entrance, to the people walking past, to his watch. At 8:02 p.m., he stood up, left the newspaper on the table, and walked out of the library. Jessica remained hidden behind a shelf of reference books, watching. 10 minutes later, a man in his mid-50s, wearing a gray suit and glasses, sat down at the same table, picked up the newspaper, folded it, and left. Jessica had been briefed on dead drops during her security clearance training at Hughes. She knew what she'd just witnessed, and she knew that her boyfriend wasn't a freelance translator struggling to make ends meet in Los Angeles. He was something else entirely, and she had been sleeping beside him for 14 months without knowing who he actually was. For 2 weeks after witnessing the dead drop at the library, Jessica existed in a state of paralysis, unable to move forward with reporting what she knew, and unable to continue pretending that everything was normal. Her security clearance required her to report any contact with foreign intelligence operatives, any compromise of classified information, any behavior that suggested espionage activity. The training had been explicit about this. Failure to report was itself a security violation, potentially criminal depending on the circumstances and the extent of her knowledge. But reporting Daniel meant destroying him, meant watching federal agents arrest the man she'd built a life with, meant testifying against him in court, meant accepting that everything between them had been a lie constructed for operational purposes. She began reviewing every document she'd brought home from Hughes over the past 14 months, trying to remember what she'd left on her desk in the apartment, what Daniel might have had access to while she slept or showered or ran errands. Most of it had been routine administrative materials, personnel files, scheduling documents, nothing that would interest foreign intelligence. But there had been occasions when she'd brought home briefing papers to proofread, technical reports that needed formatting, materials that were classified at levels that required secure storage. She'd kept them in her briefcase, locked, but the briefcase had sat in their bedroom, and she'd never considered that Daniel might know how to pick a simple combination lock. On October 15th, while Daniel was out on another supposed client meeting, Jessica searched the apartment systematically, looking for anything else he might be hiding. In the back of the closet, behind a stack of shoe boxes, she found a second wallet. This one contained a driver's license with Daniel's photograph but a different name, Michael Novotny, and an address in Toronto. There was a Canadian passport with the same name, stamps indicating travel between Canada and the United States going back to 1981. She photographed both documents with the small camera she kept for work purposes, her hands shaking so badly that she had to brace her arms against the closet wall to keep the images from blurring. She returned everything exactly as she'd found it and sat on the bedroom floor for 20 minutes, trying to process what the existence of these documents meant. If his name wasn't Daniel Kovač, if he wasn't who he claimed to be, then every conversation they'd ever had, every intimate moment, every plan they'd made for the future had been built on a foundation of calculated deception. On October 22nd, Daniel took her to dinner at a restaurant overlooking the ocean in Malibu, the kind of place they only went for special occasions because of the expense. Halfway through the meal, he reached across the table, took her hand, and asked her to marry him. He'd bought a ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond, modest but thoughtful, exactly the kind of thing she would have chosen for herself. Jessica felt her throat close, felt tears forming that she couldn't explain to him, couldn't attribute to joy when what she was actually feeling was horror. Was this part of the operation? Was marriage the next stage in whatever plan his handlers had designed? Or was this genuine, a complication in his mission, evidence that somewhere beneath the lies there was something real? She said yes because she didn't know what else to say, because refusing would have revealed that she knew something was wrong, and she needed more time to figure out what to do. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and she looked at it glinting in the candlelight and felt like she was watching someone else's life unfold. On October 26th, the decision was made for her. She came home early from work, claiming illness, and found Daniel in their bedroom with a small camera, photographing a technical report she'd left on the desk the night before. She'd been careless, exhausted, had told herself she'd lock it in her briefcase in the morning. Now she stood in the hallway, watching through the crack in the door as he methodically photographed each page, his movements practiced and efficient. When he finished, he returned the document to exactly where it had been, checked the room to make sure nothing else was disturbed, and left. Jessica waited in the bathroom until she heard the front door close, then went to the bedroom and stared at the desk, at the report sitting there as if nothing had happened. She called the FBI the next morning. On the morning of October 28th, Jessica walked into the FBI field office in Westwood and asked to speak to someone in counterintelligence. She was directed to a small conference room on the 3rd floor, where she waited for 40 minutes before a woman in her early 40s entered, introduced herself as Special Agent Carolyn Brennan, and asked Jessica to explain why she was there. Jessica began with the discovery of the microfilm on September 18th and continued through everything she'd observed over the subsequent 6 weeks. The pattern of the films appearing and disappearing, the dead drop at the library, the second wallet with the Canadian identification, the moment she'd watched Daniel photograph classified documents in their bedroom. When she finished, she added that she understood she'd violated security protocols by waiting this long to report, that she was prepared to accept whatever consequences came from her delay, but that she needed them to know what was happening before any more damage was done. Brennan listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small leather-bound notebook, her expression neutral and professional. When Jessica finished, Brennan asked a series of questions about Daniel's background, his claimed history, the names of people he'd mentioned, places he'd said he'd worked. Jessica answered as thoroughly as she could, but realized with growing unease how little she actually knew about the man she'd agreed to marry. Brennan left the room for approximately 20 minutes, and when she returned, she was accompanied by another agent, a man named Foster, who informed Jessica that the FBI had been tracking suspected Eastern European intelligence activity in the Los Angeles area for the past 18 months, and that the information she'd provided represented a significant breakthrough in their investigation. Then Brennan asked Jessica if she would be willing to continue her relationship with Daniel and help the FBI gather additional evidence by wearing a recording device during conversations with him. Jessica's first response was immediate and instinctive. She told them no, that she couldn't do that what they were asking was impossible. Brennan's reply was direct and unsparing. She said that Daniel had betrayed Jessica first, that he'd likely targeted her specifically because of her security clearance and her access to classified materials at Hughes Aircraft, that everything about their relationship had been engineered for intelligence purposes. She said that the documents Daniel had been photographing and passing to his handlers were related to satellite reconnaissance systems, and that the information had already caused damage to American national security. She said that Jessica could help stop that damage and help ensure that Daniel faced consequences for what he'd done, or she could walk away and leave the case incomplete and unresolved. Jessica agreed on November 1st to wear a wire during a conversation with Daniel at their apartment. The recording equipment was small, taped to her chest beneath her clothing, with a microphone positioned near her collar. An FBI surveillance team was stationed in a van 3 blocks away, monitoring the audio feed in real time. Jessica returned home at her usual time after work and found Daniel in the kitchen making dinner, pasta with marinara sauce, something simple they ate several times a week. She sat at the kitchen table and asked him about his day, about his translation work, about the clients he'd been meeting with. He answered easily, describing a project involving technical manuals for a manufacturing company, providing details that sounded plausible, but that Jessica now understood were likely fabricated. She asked him about his childhood in Prague, about his family, about how he'd ended up in the United States. His answers were smooth and practiced, the same stories he'd told her before, and she listened to him lie while the recording device captured every word. On November 3rd, Brennan informed Jessica that the FBI planned to arrest Daniel on the morning of the November 5th, after one final dead drop that they intended to surveil and document. That gave Jessica 2 more days with him. 2 more days of pretending that their relationship had a future. 2 more days of living inside a lie. On the evening of November 4th, Daniel took her to the same restaurant in Malibu where he'd proposed 2 weeks earlier. He talked about wedding plans, about whether they should have a small ceremony or something larger, about whether they should stay in Los Angeles or move somewhere else to start fresh. Jessica nodded and smiled and contributed to the conversation while feeling something inside her break apart piece by piece. They returned to the apartment after midnight, and Daniel fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from the week. Jessica lay beside him in the darkness, listening to him breathe, and cried silently into her pillow. On the morning of November 5th, she left the apartment at 6:30, telling Daniel she had an early meeting at work. She drove to the FBI field office and sat in a conference room while agents prepared for the arrest. At 7:15 in the morning on November 5, 1983, FBI agents executed an arrest warrant at the apartment on Sepulveda Boulevard. Jessica was present, positioned in the living room when they entered, playing the role of the shocked girlfriend who had no idea what was happening. Daniel emerged from the bedroom in sweatpants and a t-shirt, his hair uncombed, his expression moving from confusion to comprehension in the span of seconds, as he saw the agents and then saw Jessica standing there with her arms crossed, unable to meet his eyes. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he asked a single question. "How long?" Jessica couldn't answer. An agent read Daniel his rights and placed him in handcuffs, and as they led him toward the door, he turned back once more, his face no longer showing anger or betrayal, but something closer to resignation, as if he'd always known this moment would eventually arrive. At the FBI field office, Daniel was placed in an interrogation room, and over the next 6 hours, his identity and his mission unraveled in statements that were recorded and transcribed by federal agents. His real name was Dmitry Volkov. He was an intelligence officer with the Czechoslovak State Security Service, the STB, operating under deep cover in the United States since August of 1981. He'd been recruited by Czech intelligence in 1979 while working as a translator in Prague, initially for financial reasons after his father had accumulated gambling debts that threatened the family. His mission in Los Angeles had been specific: cultivate sources within the defense industry, particularly individuals with access to classified materials related to aerospace and satellite technology. Jessica Hartman had been identified as a potential asset in early 1982 through surveillance of Hughes Aircraft employees, and Daniel, or Dmitry, had been instructed to make contact and develop a relationship. Jessica listened to the interrogation through a one-way mirror in an adjacent room, Agent Brennan standing beside her, as Daniel explained in careful, emotionless detail how he'd engineered their meeting at the bookstore, how he'd gradually built trust over months of dating, how he'd begun asking subtle questions about her work to assess what information she might have access to. But then his tone shifted slightly when Brennan asked whether his feelings for Jessica had been entirely fabricated for operational purposes. Daniel paused, looked down at his hands still cuffed in front of him, and said that the mission had become complicated, that he'd developed genuine feelings that his handlers had not anticipated, and that had made his work more difficult. Jessica felt something inside her chest twist painfully at these words, unable to determine whether this was another lie, another manipulation, or whether somewhere in the past 14 months there had been something real buried beneath the deception. The search of the apartment revealed equipment and materials that documented a 3-year intelligence operation. Agents found additional cameras, development chemicals stored in a locked case in the closet, copies of documents that Jessica recognized from Hughes, and a coded notebook containing what appeared to be meeting schedules and communication protocols. The FBI opened an investigation into Jessica's own conduct, examining whether she'd knowingly participated in any security breaches or had been aware of Daniel's activities before September. After 2 weeks of interviews and polygraph examinations, agents concluded that Jessica had been an unwitting victim rather than a willing participant, but her security clearance was suspended pending further review. Hughes Aircraft terminated her employment in late November, citing her inability to maintain required security protocols regardless of her intentions or awareness. Daniel Volkov pleaded guilty in December of 1983 to charges of espionage and conspiracy to commit espionage, avoiding a trial that would have required Jessica to testify against him in open court. In March of 1984, he was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Jessica attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom, and when the judge asked if Daniel had anything to say before the sentence was pronounced, he stood and spoke briefly about accepting responsibility for his actions. Then, before sitting down, he turned and looked directly at Jessica across the courtroom. They held eye contact for perhaps 5 seconds, neither of them speaking, neither of them able to communicate across the distance what had been lost or what had ever been real. After the hearing concluded, Jessica walked out of the courthouse and told Agent Brennan that she never wanted contact with Daniel Volkov again, that she wanted to move forward with her life as if the past 14 months had never happened. She moved out of the apartment in April, packing their shared belongings into boxes, separating what was hers from what was his, dismantling the life they'd constructed together. In the back of Daniel's desk drawer, mixed in with papers and office supplies that would be seized as evidence, she found a receipt for the engagement ring he'd given her, purchased 3 weeks before he'd proposed. She sat on the bedroom floor holding that receipt and wondered whether he'd bought it because his handlers had instructed him to deepen his cover, or whether he'd bought it because some part of him had actually wanted to marry her. Jessica spent the next 2 years rebuilding her life in fragments, finding work in administrative positions that didn't require security clearances, moving to a smaller apartment in Culver City where no one knew her history, attending therapy sessions twice a week with a counselor who specialized in trauma and betrayal. She tried dating in 1985 and 1986, men she met through friends or at work, ordinary relationships that should have been easy and uncomplicated. But she found herself analyzing every conversation for inconsistencies, questioning every detail about their backgrounds, unable to trust that anything anyone told her was true. The relationships ended after a few weeks or months, and eventually Jessica stopped trying, accepting that whatever capacity for trust she'd once possessed had been permanently damaged by those 14 months with Daniel. In March of 1987, the first letter arrived from the Federal Correctional Institution in Lompoc, where Daniel was serving his sentence. Jessica recognized his handwriting on the envelope, and she placed it in a shoebox in her closet without opening it. More letters came over the following months, sometimes 2 or 3 in a single week, then nothing for months, then another cluster of envelopes. She kept all of them unopened in the box, unable to read them, but equally unable to throw them away. In June of 1990, a woman who'd worked with Daniel at a language school before his arrest called to inform Jessica that Daniel's mother had died in Czechoslovakia, and that he'd been denied permission to attend the funeral. Jessica felt an unexpected surge of grief for him, imagining him locked in a prison cell while his mother was buried on the other side of the world, and she almost opened one of the letters that night, almost allowed herself to connect with him across the distance. But she didn't. She returned the box to the closet and tried to forget the phone call. The Berlin Wall fell in November of 1989, and the Soviet Union began its collapse in 1991. And Jessica watched these events on television with a strange sense of disconnection, understanding that the geopolitical struggle that had defined her relationship with Daniel, that had turned their private life into a Cold War battlefield, was ending. The cause that had justified his betrayal, the ideological framework that had made espionage seem necessary or noble, was crumbling, and she wondered whether he felt any of his sacrifice had been worth the cost. In 1992, Daniel was denied parole after his first hearing. In 1993, his second parole hearing was successful, and in May of 1994, he was released from federal custody and immediately deported to the Czech Republic. Jessica learned about his release from a brief news article in the Los Angeles Times, a small item on page 6 that mentioned the deportation of a former Czech intelligence officer who'd operated in Southern California during the 1980s. She read the article 3 times, trying to imagine where he would go. What kind of life awaited him in a country that had fundamentally changed during his 12 years in prison? In June, a letter arrived with a Prague postmark. Jessica held the envelope for a long time before opening it, and when she finally did, she found 3 pages written in Daniel's careful handwriting. He acknowledged what he'd done to her, the betrayal and the deception and the manipulation. He said he understood if she hated him and that he didn't expect forgiveness. But he also said that his feelings for her had been real, complicated and compromised by his mission, but real nonetheless. And he'd spent 12 years in prison wondering if she'd ever believe that. He didn't ask to see her or to reestablish contact. He simply asked if someday she might be able to forgive him. Jessica sat at her kitchen table and read the letter 4 times. Then she took out a pen and a single sheet of paper and began writing a response. What she wrote, she never told anyone, not her therapist, not her friends, not the few family members who knew any part of her story. She sealed the letter in an envelope, addressed it to the return address in Prague, and mailed it the following morning. Whether Daniel ever received it, whether he responded, whether any further communication passed between them, remained private. By 1994, Jessica was 39 years old. She'd built a stable life, working as an office manager for a commercial real estate company, living alone in a rent-controlled apartment with a view of a park where she sometimes walked in the evenings. She'd learned to trust selectively, to build friendships carefully, to accept that some questions would never have satisfying answers. The box of unopened letters remained in her closet, 43 envelopes spanning 7 years, a physical archive of a relationship that had existed in the space between truth and deception. The one opened envelope from Prague sat on top, evidence that she'd allowed herself, finally, to respond. On a Saturday afternoon in October, Jessica found herself in a bookstore in Santa Monica, not far from where she'd first met Daniel 12 years earlier. She walked through the aisles slowly, running her fingers along the spines of books in the foreign language section, remembering when love had felt simple, and when trust had come easily, and when she hadn't yet learned that the person sleeping beside you could be someone you'd never actually known.